Medieval weapons weren't just deadly. They were designed to humiliate, cripple, and terrify. Each invention reveals a chilling truth. Survival wasn't luck. It was a miracle. Which of these 10 horrors would you fear the most? When medieval foot soldiers faced heavily armored knights, they needed something that could turn expensive plate armor into useless metal. The Morning Star delivered exactly that kind of brutal efficiency. This wasn't some delicate fencing weapon. It was pure crushing force wrapped around a simple but deadly design. Picture an iron ball covered in razor-sharp spikes mounted on a wooden shaft that could reach up to 4 feet long. The weight distribution was perfect for maximum impact. When a soldier swung this thing, physics took over. The heavy ball built up incredible momentum, and those spikes concentrated all that force into tiny points of contact. Plate armor? Didn't matter. Chainmail? Forget about it. The Morning Star didn't need to cut through metal. It just crushed whatever was underneath. Bones shattered, ribs collapsed. Even if the spikes didn't penetrate the armor completely, the blunt force trauma could kill a man instantly. Then there's the psychological warfare aspect. Imagine hearing that distinctive whistling sound as someone swung a spiked iron ball towards your head. Most opponents lost their nerve before the weapon even connected. Cavalry units adapted the design with shorter handles, typically around 2 feet long. Knights on horseback could wield these compact versions effectively, using their horses' momentum to add even more devastating power to each strike. The shorter shaft meant better control while mounted, but the crushing capability remained just as lethal. But here's what made the Morning Star truly terrifying in battle. It could destroy shields with a single well-placed hit. Wooden shields splintered, metal shields dented so badly they became impossible to hold. Once an opponent lost their shield, they were completely exposed to follow-up attacks. The weapon required minimal training compared to swords or bows. Swing hard, aim for the head or torso, let physics handle the rest. This simplicity made it perfect for common foot soldiers who couldn't afford years of combat training. While knights pranced around with their fancy long swords, these brutal clubs were changing the entire dynamic of medieval warfare. Speaking of weapons that revolutionized combat, nothing quite matched the range and precision of what English archers brought to the battlefield. While foot soldiers were swinging Morning Stars at close range, something far deadlier was happening from across the battlefield. English archers were turning warfare into a nightmare from 250 yards away. The longbow wasn't just another weapon, it was a machine of destruction that could punch through plate armor like it was made of tin foil. These weren't the cute little bows you see in movies. We're talking about 6-foot monsters that required so much strength to pull that archers developed permanently deformed skeletons. Their left arms were actually thicker than their right arms from years of training. Here's where it gets terrifying. A skilled archer could fire up to 12 arrows per minute. That's one arrow every 5 seconds, raining down death with mechanical precision. At battles like Crécy and Agincourt, thousands of these archers worked together like a medieval machine gun squad. The sky would go dark with arrows before they crashed down on enemy formations. But the real horror wasn't just getting hit, it was what happened next. Arrow wounds were basically a death sentence, just a slow one. The barbed heads would tear massive holes going in, and removing them often caused more damage than the initial hit. Infection was guaranteed. Even if you survived the battle, you'd probably die screaming weeks later. The craziest part? It took about 15 years to train a proper longbow archer. Kings literally had to plan generations ahead to build their archer armies. They'd start boys at age 7, pulling lighter bows until their bodies adapted to the punishment. These weapons were so effective, they changed how entire wars were fought. Heavy cavalry charges, the dominant military tactic for centuries, became suicide missions. Knights in full armor would charge forward only to get turned into pincushions before they could even reach the enemy lines. The English basically created medieval snipers, picking off targets from distances that seemed impossible. What made this even more dangerous was that you couldn't see it coming until arrows started dropping around you. Speaking of weapons that caught enemies completely off guard, after watching arrows rain down on battlefields, soldiers needed something that could get up close and personal with heavily armored knights. Enter the poleaxe, a weapon that basically said, "Your fancy armor means nothing to me." This wasn't your typical medieval weapon. The poleaxe combined 3 different ways to ruin someone's day: a chopping axe, a piercing spike, and a hammer, all mounted on a shaft that could reach 6 feet long. Think of it as medieval multi-tool, except every attachment was designed to kill you. The weight alone tells you everything. These beasts could tip the scales at 8 pounds. Try swinging that around for a few minutes, and you'll understand why medieval warriors had arms like tree trunks. But here's the genius part. That weight wasn't a bug, it was a feature. When a poleaxe connected with a helmet, physics took over. Even the finest plate armor couldn't distribute that kind of focused impact. Knights at Agincourt found this out the hard way. While longbow arrows were falling like deadly rain, the real carnage happened when fighters closed distance with poleaxes. These weapons could crack skulls through steel, dent breastplates beyond repair, and turn a proud knight into a very expensive pile of scrap metal. The versatility made it deadly in any situation. Facing a heavily armored opponent, use the hammer side to turn their helmet into a bell. Fighting someone with lighter protection, the axe blade could cleave through mail like scissors through paper. Need to punch through plate armor? That spike on top wasn't just for show. What made poleaxes truly terrifying was their reach combined with stopping power. You couldn't get close enough to use a sword effectively, but they could still deliver bone-crushing force from several feet away. Makes sense why they became the go-to weapon for the serious medieval combat, right? But even the mighty poleaxe had its limitations when it came to battlefield versatility. Sometimes you needed something that could cut through entire formations at once, something that required a completely different approach to medieval warfare. When it comes to pure intimidation factor, nothing beats seeing a warrior swinging around what's basically a metal telephone pole with a blade. The zweihander wasn't just big, it was ridiculously big. We're talking about swords that could reach nearly 7 feet long. That's taller than most people back then. These monsters weighed up to 14 pounds. To put that in perspective, that's like swinging a bowling ball attached to a metal stick. Your average knight probably needed serious upper body strength just to lift one, let alone fight with it for hours. But here's where it gets interesting. These weren't just for show. The zweihander was specifically designed to break pike formations. Picture hundreds of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder with long spears pointed at you. Scary, right? Well, not if you're the guy with the giant sword who can literally chop through multiple pike shafts in one swing. The reach advantage was everything. While your enemies are trying to get close enough to stab you, you're already cutting them down from 6 feet away. Some skilled warriors could supposedly decapitate several enemies with a single swing. Makes sense when you think about it. All that weight and momentum concentrated into one devastating arc. Then there's the psychological warfare aspect. Imagine you're a regular foot soldier and you see this massive warrior coming at you with what looks like a giant sword. Half the battle was won before the fighting even started. People would literally run away rather than face someone wielding one of these things. The weird part is that despite their size, experienced fighters could move these swords surprisingly fast. Years of training turned these weapons into extensions of their bodies. They weren't just swinging them around wildly, there was actual technique involved. Of course, carrying around a 7-foot sword had its problems. Try getting through a doorway with that thing, but when you needed to break enemy lines or clear a path through chaos, nothing else came close to the sheer destructive power of the zweihander. Speaking of power, there was another weapon that focused on precision rather than size. While knights spent years mastering swords and foot soldiers struggled with heavy morning stars, medieval armies desperately needed something different, something deadly that didn't require a lifetime of training. Enter the crossbow, a weapon so brutally effective that the Pope himself banned it in 1139, calling it too deadly for Christians to use against each other. Well, that lasted about as long as you'd expect. The genius wasn't in complexity. A crossbow worked like a horizontal bow mounted on a wooden stock, but here's what made it revolutionary. Any peasant could pick one up and potentially kill an armored knight within hours of basic instruction. No years of muscle-building archery practice required. The mechanical advantage was devastating. While English longbows demanded incredible upper body strength, crossbows used a stirrup and lever system to cock the string. This meant more consistent power behind every bolt, and bolts packed a different kind of punch than arrows. Shorter, thicker, and heavier. They punched through mail like it was fabric. Range? Up to 200 yards of accurate death. But the real game changer was rate of fire during sieges and prolonged battles. A crossbowman could maintain steady shooting for hours without the arm fatigue that crippled longbow archers. Medieval armies loved the crossbow for another crucial reason: mass production. Unlike longbows that required specific wood types and individual crafting, crossbows could be manufactured in workshops using standardized parts. Suddenly, you could arm hundreds of soldiers with identical, reliable weapons. The psychological impact was equally brutal. Knights who'd trained since childhood found themselves outranged by common soldiers who'd learned the weapon in weeks. Social hierarchy meant nothing when a bolt could punch through the finest armor money could buy. Then there's the tactical flexibility. Crossbows worked equally well from castle walls, behind shields, or in tight formations. They didn't need the wide stance and clear space that longbows demanded. But even crossbows had limitations that medieval engineers were already solving with more refined weapon designs. Some warriors needed something more personal, more devastating in close combat. While longbows needed years of training and swords required finesse, the warhammer was refreshingly straightforward. You grabbed it, you swung it, and whatever you hit probably died. No complicated techniques, no fancy footwork, just pure devastating force delivered directly to someone's skull. The beauty of this weapon lay in its brutal simplicity. A heavy iron or steel head mounted on a sturdy wooden handle, usually about 2 to 3 feet long. Some versions featured a flat striking surface on one side for maximum crushing power. Others included a wicked spike on the back, perfect for punching through even the thickest plate armor. Knights spent fortunes on their protective gear, only to discover that a peasant with a warhammer could turn their expensive helmet into a very costly death trap. What made warhammers truly terrifying was physics. When you swing a hammer, all that force concentrates into a tiny impact point. Doesn't matter how thick your armor is, that energy has to go somewhere. Usually, it went straight into the wearer's brain. Then there's the psychological factor. Getting shot by an arrow was quick, almost clinical, but hearing the wet crunch of a warhammer connecting with someone's head, that sound stuck with survivors forever. The weapon proved so effective that even mounted knights adopted lighter versions for cavalry use. Imagine charging into battle on horseback, warhammer raised, knowing that one solid hit would end any opponent regardless of their armor quality. Infantry versions were heavier, designed for foot soldiers who could put their full body weight behind each devastating swing. Medieval armorers tried desperately to counter this threat. They made helmets thicker, added extra padding, experimented with different steel alloys. Nothing worked consistently. The warhammer's crushing force simply transferred through metal and padding alike, turning protective gear into elaborate torture devices. But while foot soldiers were perfecting the art of skull crushing with handheld weapons, medieval engineers were thinking much bigger. They were building machines that could hurl massive stones across impossible distances and flatten entire castle walls. While knights were busy crushing skulls with warhammers, medieval engineers had their eyes on something much bigger. They wanted to knock down entire castle walls from hundreds of yards away. Enter the trebuchet, basically the nuclear weapon of its time, except it ran on gravity and really heavy rocks. This wasn't your typical catapult. The trebuchet could launch a 200-pound stone over 300 yards with terrifying accuracy. That's like throwing a motorcycle the length of 3 football fields. The secret? A massive counterweight system that could weigh over 7,000 pounds. When that weight dropped, physics did the rest. Castle defenders absolutely hated these things. One day, you're sitting pretty behind thick stone walls, feeling invincible. The next day, boulders the size of refrigerators are smashing through your bedroom window. Walls that took decades to build could crumble in hours once trebuchets showed up to the party. But here's where it gets really nasty. Medieval armies didn't just throw rocks. They launched dead horses, rotting cows, and plague-infested corpses over castle walls. Biological warfare, medieval style. Imagine trying to enjoy your dinner while diseased animal parts rain down from the sky. The psychological impact was huge, too. The sound alone, that deep mechanical groaning followed by the whistle of incoming death, could break morale before the first wall fell. Defenders knew that once trebuchets were assembled outside their gates, the siege had just gotten very serious, very quickly. Setting these monsters up wasn't easy, though. They required skilled engineers, tons of materials, and days of assembly. Plus, they were sitting ducks for enemy raids. But when they worked, game over. Castle after castle fell to these mechanical beasts throughout the medieval period. The The trebuchet changed siege warfare forever. No fortress was truly safe anymore. Yet even this devastating weapon had its limitations against smaller, more mobile threats. Sometimes you needed something that could pick off individual targets with surgical precision from incredible distances. While trebuchets were busy smashing castle walls, medieval armies had another problem. How do you pick off that one annoying commander shouting orders from behind enemy lines? Enter the Scorpion, basically the medieval world's answer to a sniper rifle. This wasn't your typical battlefield weapon. The Scorpion used twisted animal sinews and horsehair wound tight as springs to launch iron-tipped darts with deadly precision. Think of it like a giant crossbow that ate its vegetables and hit the gym every day. The torsion power generated by those twisted fibers could send a dart screaming toward targets up to 400 yards away. But here's where it gets interesting. While other siege weapons were all about raw destruction, the Scorpion was surgical. Medieval engineers spent years perfecting its accuracy because missing your target meant giving away your position. These machines could thread a needle compared to the chaos of trebuchets hurling boulders everywhere. The psychological impact was brutal. Imagine you're a knight thinking you're safe behind your army's front lines, maybe giving some inspiring speech to boost morale. Suddenly, your buddy next to you drops dead with an iron dart through his chest. You can't even see where it came from. That kind of fear spreads fast through an army. What made the Scorpion truly terrifying was its stealth factor. Unlike the thunderous crash of trebuchets announcing their presence, Scorpions operated almost silently. Death came without warning from distances that seemed impossible for the time period. Defenders on castle walls learned to never stand still for too long. Medieval engineers constantly refined these machines, adjusting the torsion mechanisms and improving the dart design. Some versions could punch through light armor at maximum range. Others sacrificed distance for even better accuracy at shorter ranges. The beauty of the Scorpion lay in its simplicity and effectiveness. While massive siege engines required dozens of men to operate, a small crew could set up and fire a Scorpion quickly, then relocate before enemy forces could respond. Of course, precision weapons were just one part of medieval warfare. Sometimes you needed something more direct for close combat situations. While knights obsessed over fancy swords and elaborate poleaxes, foot soldiers discovered something brutally simple. Why bother with sharp edges when you could just smash everything into pieces? The mace became medieval warfare's answer to the sledgehammer. Pure crushing power in your hands. No finesse required, no years of sword training needed. Just swing hard and watch armor crumple like a tin can. Here's what made maces terrifyingly effective. They didn't need to cut through armor. Physics did all the work. When a solid iron or steel club weighing several pounds connects with your helmet, the force transfers straight through the metal into your skull. Your expensive plate armor? Completely useless against blunt trauma. Medieval blacksmiths crafted these weapons with deadly efficiency in mind. Some featured flanged heads with metal ridges that concentrated impact into smaller areas. Others used simple rounded balls of iron that distributed crushing force across wider surfaces. Both designs guaranteed broken bones, but the real genius was in their simplicity. A village blacksmith could forge a basic mace in a fraction of the time needed for a sword. No complex blade geometry, no edge maintenance, no worrying about keeping it sharp. Just solid metal on a wooden handle. Foot soldiers loved maces for crowd control during sieges and urban fighting. Swing one into a group of enemies and multiple opponents went down. The psychological effect was devastating too. Hearing bones crack and seeing comrades collapse from blunt force trauma broke morale faster than clean sword cuts. Even glancing blows caused permanent damage. A mace striking your arm didn't just bruise, it shattered the bone underneath your mail. Hit someone's leg and they'd never walk properly again. Strike a torso and ribs exploded inward. Knights eventually adopted maces themselves, especially when fighting other heavily armored opponents. Why struggle to find gaps in plate armor when you could simply dent it inward? The mace proved that medieval combat wasn't always about elegant technique. Sometimes brute force trumped everything else. Speaking of unconventional weapons that changed warfare, peasants discovered they already owned something that could be even more devastating in battle. Here's something most people don't realize about medieval warfare. Some of the deadliest weapons weren't forged in castle armories or crafted by master blacksmiths. They came straight from the farm. The war scythe turned peaceful harvest tools into instruments of terror. Farmers would literally take their grain-cutting scythes and mount the curved blades differently, flipping them to extend forward like a spear rather than sideways. What you got was a weapon that combined the reach of a pike with the slicing power of a sword. And boy, was it effective in the chaos of battle. The curved blade could sweep through multiple enemies in a single swing. Unlike straight swords that required precise thrusts, the war scythe's design meant you could slash in wide arcs, catching anyone unlucky enough to be in range. The blade itself stretched nearly 2 feet in some cases, mounted on wooden handles that reached up to 8 feet long. Peasant uprisings became particularly brutal when war scythes appeared. Suddenly, farmers who'd spent their lives cutting wheat were cutting down armored knights with weapons they actually knew how to use. The learning curve? Almost zero. If you could harvest crops, you could harvest enemies. But here's where things get really nasty. The curved blade didn't just cut, it hooked. Once it caught an opponent, you could yank them off balance or drag them to the ground. Cavalry found this especially problematic since a skilled wielder could literally pull riders from their horses. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical damage. Imagine being a professional soldier, only to face farmers wielding modified farming tools that could slice you in half. There's something deeply unsettling about dying to a repurposed agricultural implement. Speed was another advantage. The lightweight design allowed for rapid strikes and quick recovery. Heavy armor provided little protection against the sweeping cuts that could find gaps or simply overwhelm defensive positions. Well, that covers 10 of history's most brutal medieval weapons. From morning stars crushing skulls to war scythes turning farmers into warriors, medieval combat was definitely not for the faint of heart.